Next guest is an excellent writer, has done a lot of great work, and has posed what I consider to be a fascinating topic in a recent piece for BuzzFeed. Eve Fairbanks is a journalist. She has been nominated for awards and that. She's gotten a number of fine grants in journalism. She has been part of the, I'm reading now, Institute of Current World Affairs grant, Daniel Pearl Investigative Journalism Initiative, the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting, and so on. But she had a piece the other day in BuzzFeed entitled, "Well-Off Millennials Are All Julia Salazar. I Wish We Weren't." And I know we don't always write our own headlines in the writing trade, but it was such a fascinating piece. I wanted to talk to her about it. So first of all, Eve Fairbanks, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much, RJ. Thanks a lot.
Secondly, you know, I always go through this when I have writers on to talk about a piece of theirs. I'm always tempted to say, now you wrote a piece that says this and this, but I feel like that's a little weird because you actually wrote it. So would you do us a favor and just sort of maybe briefly, obviously if you could say it briefly, you wouldn't have used, 900 words, whatever you used, but just with the gist of what you wrote in this piece?
Sure. Yeah, I guess, so I live in South Africa, and so I'm kind of in and out in American politics, but obviously the Salazar campaign towards the end was getting a lot of attention, and I kept reading pieces and I kept seeing headlines that seemed to treat it a little bit in a soap operatic way, like almost like a tabloid kind of treatment of the end of the campaign with a lot of shock. So it was kind of revelation after revelation. Julia Salazar said this about her Jewish ancestry, and it's not really exactly like that. Julia Salazar said she graduated from Columbia. She never quite got her degree. Julia Salazar said she came from this working class background, and her brother challenged that, I think in a Daily Mail piece with photographs of her family's house down in Florida. She's, again, a candidate. She was a candidate who won her primary for the Brooklyn State Senate in New York. And I guess, as I was reading these articles, there was really a tone of surprise and shock, like who could do this, and this is so startling, and this is a really big deal. And I just had this thought based in part on some other work I had been doing earlier in the year, and kind of memories I had been dredging up from when I was younger. I'm 35 years old, and I just wanted to say, like, guys, this is a thing. To basically, I won't say fabricate, but I think a whole lot of people who are, I'm going to say, in my cohort, which I was born in 1983, so maybe people born in the 80s, even through the early 90s, and it may be a wider phenomenon which we can talk about, but are kind of, my memory of growing up was we felt a real need or a desire to present or to forefront aspects of struggle in our background. So let me take myself. My grandmother was an illegal immigrant to the United States. She was very, very poor. She came alone. My father has very distant Native American heritage. And I was also born with a birth defect related to my esophagus. So these would be things that I would kind of tell people when I was young, when people would ask about yourself or when you would seek to describe yourself in your history. But it really, I could have also told a story about myself. I grew up in a two-parent home in suburbia, went to an extremely good magnet public school, had almost every kind of advantage, went to a great university, much more privileged, elite, or successful family story. But there was this longing to have something about yourself that signaled struggle. And so many people would do that. I mean, one thing I thought about was the way that my friends and I would characterize where we were from. Let's say when we went to university and everyone's introducing themselves. I would always say I'd grown up in Adams Morgan. in Washington, which, if you know Washington at all, Adams Morgan, I don't know what other neighborhoods to equate it to, but it was in the 80s quite Hispanic, kind of urban. It became quite hip, a bit gritty. But I lived there only until I was 6 years old. But it was a really important thing for me as a kind of cred to be able to say I came from Washington. And people always say, oh, you come from Washington. Do you mean the real Washington? And I would be able to, with great pleasure, say, yes, the real Washington. I'm from the real D.C. I have some memories of D.C., but mostly I grew up in the suburbs. And a friend of mine in New York was telling me when that he grew up in Brooklyn, I believe in Flatbush, and he used to get so annoyed at people from Westchester or other parts of the kind of New York City area would say, oh, I grew up in New York, and that they were trying to sort of claim something, let's say an urbanness, a grit, a bit of a struggle, that they didn't really have. So I guess I just wanted to, in the piece, and I gave many examples of this from my own life and from the lives of my friends. And I just wanted to say this is just not that uncommon. And in fact, it's rather representative. And we ought to think about it rather than sort of put Salazar in some corner as some kind of exception. And a lot of people were, especially who weren't from the district, were saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe people would elect her. She's a pathological liar. And I wanted to ask more broadly, like, this is a social phenomenon. Why do we do this? And what are the downsides?
Well, I think that was one of the reasons why I enjoyed the piece so much and found it evocative was I do think it's a fairly widespread phenomenon. I mean, and certainly your piece suggested that maybe people thought, well, this scandal will derail the Julia Salazar campaign, and people were like, almost, there's the possibility anyway that voters in her districts, well, everybody does that, and if everybody does that, and a lot of people do it, then it raises a lot of really interesting questions about, number one, of course, why do we do this? You use the word in your description of the piece. At one point, you used the word in passing, the word longing. That to me, there is an element of longing in this for, I think authenticity is also a key word that somehow I thought of my own biography, and I am not in the millennial or close to the millennial cohort, but it should be self-evident. But the fact that I lived part of my childhood in Utica, New York, working class background, my father was a teacher and so on, very, economically very working class, but intellectual household. And then later in my childhood, we moved to the suburbs of New York City, much more comfortable. My father got a very good job as a community college president. And, a lot of times I focus on the Utica aspect of my biography more. I think I do it maybe partially for authenticity, but I think to say that I actually remember I do remember the working class at its peak, when a person with one working class income could buy a house, support a family, have a used car, and everything was okay. So that is one of the reasons why I do it. But I think a lot of people do it to the point of deception, like Julia Salazar arguably did, maybe just over the line, but still very close to the line. And then I guess the question is, why do we do this? Is it more pronounced among people at or near millennial age? And why is it in our politics? Because you talk about how people, emphasize their identity in political debates. Why is it we've reached a point in our politics where you can't, some people feel at least, that you can't meaningfully articulate a left point of view, for example, without validating it in your own background somehow by saying, and I've really felt this pain myself. Why isn't empathy an equally legitimate motivator for politics and so on? So I don't know. I mean, I'm throwing a lot out there, but any thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, to pick up on the word longing and to underscore that, I think is really right. And I think it's certainly been a strain in American history. My partner is British, and when he read the piece, he just said, "This is not so understandable to me because there's always middle class in Britain is not so nice necessarily. There's not really a kind of heroism around that, but." That was almost, I think that's been in the U.S. nearly from the beginning, that it's been part of our identity that we broke away from these elitist aristocrats. We are strivers. We are do-it-yourselfers. I think of Lincoln was the, they called him the rail splitter, and he ran, there would be posters for Lincoln, Lincoln the rail splitter. And the truth was that he had worked splitting rails for something like 6 months. He was mostly a lawyer, So in a way, he was like a pre-Salazar. I mean, not quite. But I do think that it's gotten so there's always been a kind of romanticism around making it yourself in America. I think it's gotten more pronounced. I think of my father. My father grew up not poor, but in the pretty rural South. And he then went to college in the North. And he just describes himself as he actually had to leave the university that he began at because he was apparently so relentlessly teased for his Southern accent and his clothes and his sort of hick nature. And he then set himself to expunge his Southern accent. And he does not have a Southern accent, which I remember thinking was so funny because there was one girl that I knew at Yale where I went who had like a serious sort of classic Southern accent. She'd come from Kentucky. And it was the hottest thing. Everybody was so into it. They thought it was so cool and so legit. Right. And so and I really thought, that's an interesting flip. And I guess I think back, I have a little bit in the piece kind of recalling my early childhood, which was in the 1990s. And I think there was really a situation where it was just becoming very clear that the United States as a nation no longer almost had the identity in the world anymore of that upstart, a bit sort of isolated, kind of rustic, rough, not silver spoon, not on top. That was really over. It was kind of the 90s were a weird period where there was a lot of feeling. My father was a political scientist, and I was unearthing some papers of his recently, and he wrote one called America, Indefinite Hegemony, ? And it was more about the problems that were going to occur with the indefinite American hegemony, not whether it would be indefinite, which is kind of amazing to me now to think that. But it was almost like
Francis Fukuyama and the belief that history had ended. We had seen the final conflict; it was over. America had won. And what's the authenticity in that, right? If you don't have any conflicts facing you in the future. By the way, I had to learn how to give up my working class Utica accent when we moved to the suburbs. They actually sent me still a child, to a speech therapy. And now that you mention it, I might have more authenticity if I talked like a working class white guy from the Rust Belt, but which I could do if I have to. But so I guess where I'm trying to go with this, because we only have a few minutes left, unless you want to stay another 15 minutes, in which case we can keep talking. But you want to stay another 15?
It's totally up to you. I mean, I can quickly finish that thought. I think I just I think, certainly I remember in the 90s having a feeling really young that it was kind of such an accident that I'd been born an American. And, there was so much TV, there was so much media already then, and it was very easy to see images of sort of exposés that people would do on sweatshops in Bangladesh or Somalia or the Balkans or something. And you would, I mean, I think it was, I would say I was pretty young when I already started to have the feeling that I was kind of vaguely caught up in being on top in a world that was pretty clearly unequal and unjust. And yet I was also, that was how I was being brought up, and I was being kind of coached or taught to take advantage of that and to achieve. And I think it was really anxiety producing. And I also think, that there was a kind of anxiety also produced by like decades of really effective attacks on liberals for being kind of limousine liberals.
Right.
So there was a certain tack that was taken by the right. My family was very conservative. My parents remained Republicans. And so I was very aware of that, which was kind of a lot of griping about, well, how can the Clintons, have these views because they are making now tons of money? Or how can Al Gore even step on a plane when he has his ideas? These people, they pretend to care about the poor, but they live on the Upper West Side. That was really, really relentless. And I think it kind of chipped away at the idea that one could have political beliefs based on observation and based on kind of like, I don't want to sound too pretentious, but kind of like an empathic or an intellectual critique of of what you see around you, and almost kind of reducing it to like you have to be it if you're gonna say that you care about it, which I think is terrible.
You were talking about the fact that there was this, the Clintons, your parents used to criticize the Clintons for still being, in their eyes anyway, liberal, when they were starting to make a lot of money and so on. And this notion that we have to be the thing in order to represent it. By the way, I just have to tell you a quick story because
Sure.
And it's apropos of nothing in terms of the role of Americans in the world. In the early 90s, during this period, I was working a lot with the State Department of USAID on international health projects, and I went to Albania the first month after it opened to the West, after being a garrison, basically, country for 40 years, under the communists of Enver Hoxha. And I was in a Jeep in the mountains, and we drove into a village, and they could see I was an American. So the village children came running up screaming, "Michael Jackson! Michael Jackson!" That was their association in this garrison with me, with this garrison country. That what they knew about America was cultural, and that somehow we were certainly, we believed we were forging a cultural hegemony, and I wasn't necessarily thrilled about it, but there it was. And I guess I would say this notion of identity, this notion that you have to be, and by the way, Michael Jackson is an interesting person to bring into this conversation because he had all the authenticity in the world as, a working class black kid from Gary, Indiana, but he seemed to distance himself from it. So different people respond different ways on this question of authenticity. But you raised a great question before the break that I want to go back to, which is, somehow I feel as if we on the left, and it's a tricky subject and one, a delicate subject with a lot of people, but I feel as if we on the left have somehow decided that you're not I don't say you're not entitled to speak on certain issues, but that your words don't have enough weight on certain issues if you have not experienced the requisite amount of suffering and along certain parameters of suffering. And I feel as if that's a dangerous road to go down. And I've thought about writing about it myself, and frankly, for a variety of reasons, including time, but frankly, a slight element of nervousness. I haven't written about it, but I feel as if, I don't know, what are your, I feel like this is a sort of embedded in everything you've been talking about in some way. Am I reading it wrong, or?
No, No, and I think I totally understand the nervousness. I think some things have gotten a little bit blurred. For instance, like I've seen in the last, let's say, 12 years that I've been sort of orbiting in the journalism sphere, a fairly concerted, if uneven effort, at least on the left, to get more diverse voices. So people from different class backgrounds, from different parts of the country, from different ethnic and racial backgrounds, more gender parity into media. And I think that is totally fantastic, and same should be done. We should have a Congress that looks like the American population. But on an individual level, that doesn't necessarily mean that that one can only talk about one's own experience. And I think the value of maybe, hopefully, this piece, or looking at it from this angle, is that you see sort of the downside, which is that you have a lot of people who have really, I think, earnest and serious left-wing feelings of some sort. And yet they may have been born into very wealthy families. I have a friend who, my closest girlfriend, is a feminist kind of consultant, but she comes from a very extraordinary amount of money, and she can never talk about it. And she kind of tends to note publicly that aspects of her background that are more about her suffering, which are real. Her family came from a family of Holocaust survivors. She has sexual assault history, etc. But there's also this other thing, and I think she feels she has to do that in order to not be just some kind of rich girl who's maybe advocating for things that either wouldn't really affect her or that she might not really like if they happened. That's always the critique of people who are like advocating for more social equality from the top is, well, you wouldn't want it if it really occurred. And I always want to say, well, try us, right? But I think the danger of it, firstly, is that it kind of diminishes it makes it hard for people who really do have tougher backgrounds to kind of own those or have those understood. I was speaking with a friend of mine in South Africa, but she aspires to go to university in America, and she grew up in a shack. That's what they're kind of typically referred to here, an informal dwelling made of aluminum, without shoes at times, et cetera. I mean, she's really, really, really poor. And she feels she has to just play that up in this extreme way in order to kind of like beat, say, this friend of mine who has a trust fund, but who now is playing up her suffering. But I also just think we really lose something if people are not allowed actually to look at certain situations and say, you know what, that doesn't seem right to me. That's not hitting my moral sense appropriately, even if it advantages me. I mean, I think of many historical circumstances, let's say the abolition of slavery in England or the end of apartheid in South Africa, where I live, which was the fight against apartheid in South Africa was totally Black-led, and it was a Black liberation movement. But it was absolutely aided enormously by, first of all, the sanctions of Western nations, which, you know, these were entities that were not South African and were not directly affected by this situation, but just saw that it was wrong. And also by certain white South Africans, lawyers for Mandela, et cetera, who just, even though they were totally advantaged by the system, they just said, this is not correct. And the example of those people had an extremely powerful role to play because, in a way, they created an opening for others who were not affected directly by the injustice that was being discussed. And
just to jump in, just speaking of South Africa, which I've been to and love in many ways. You also have, while it was absolutely a black-led movement and an extraordinarily courageous one, the leaders of that movement, leaders of the ANC during the days of the struggle and so on, they welcomed Joe Slovo, who is white, and they welcomed him into the struggle. They respected him, admired him, as far as I can tell. There was no sense that, he was something other. I mean, it's something I've been struggling with a lot because, for example, I'm totally with you. I would use the exact same word you used, fantastic, to talk about, the idea of changing the mix, changing the representation, making sure underrepresented communities are given prominence. I try to do this. I try to, I always struggle with trying to achieve the right gender balance and balance of different groups and identities in the guests on this show and so on. So it's something I'm extremely supportive of, but I also worry, and maybe it's because I come from, I have a political agenda. I do, and it's normally characterized as a left political agenda. With a strong, economic emphasis, that I sometimes see this, in my opinion, and I'm going to be really candid, weaponized, used as a way of saying, well, I've got a woman who may speak on behalf of policies that hurt, as a rule, women in this country economically. But I'm going to elevate that woman, and I'm going to insist that you remain silent on this topic because she knows more about it than you by dint of her identity. And I'm just picking a woman, could be any group. Whereas I have many comrades or colleagues who agree with me. I have a political philosophy that believes that these issues are inseparable, that identity justice is inseparable from economic justice. And I have, people of every identity and every group who agree with me on this. So, but I feel like sometimes there's a selective choosing of specific individuals in order to advance. And I feel that the counter to that has sometimes been, well, a Julia Salazar has to prove, something about her identity, even though, she's a woman and so on, that she'll be somehow silenced if she doesn't do that. And that may be a side of this that we ought to look at. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I'll tell you just a funny story. I mean, I have a very close relative who voted for Trump, who I speak to almost every day, very, very close to me. And I sort of made the choice not to not talk politics with that person, but to try to really talk politics with that person. And when Justice Kennedy resigned or announced that, and there was going to be a space open, I was chatting over text with this person, and she said, I said, what are you looking for? Who do you like, or what do you want in a nominee? And she said, well, this and that, but he really has to nominate a woman, and the best would be a black woman. And I laughed at her because I said, you are so anti-identity politics in certain ways, but I think it gets totally to your weaponizing. I mean, I don't think has any special interest in having a black woman on the Supreme Court, but she thought that such a person would be unassailable, right? Or less assailable, as, having black and female experience. I think it's really difficult. I mean, I think there's a mix somehow of saying, there is something that we all bring to the conversation, bring to the table that relates to our identity and the whole kind of river of our experiences that is behind that. But at the same time, I don't think you need to sort of entirely have it either or. I mean, I did a lot of reading earlier this year for a different project on the very foundations of American democracy and sort of Locke, but it was kind of an obsession with rationality, which I think was probably overdone. But there was a feeling that a democratic community has to be based not just on kind of sort of mix of identities and who is outweighing who demographically, but on something else, which is kind of judgment and the capacity. You saw in South Africa that in 1992, something like 2/3 of white South Africans voted for a constitutional referendum, which basically they knew would bring about a majoritarian democracy, which would lead to black majority rule. So you had people voting for something based on a lot of arguments about justice that was not in their self-interest. Now, I don't know if some of those people maybe regret that now, but nevertheless, they did that. And that was an extremely powerful moment. And I think there really is a role for your judgment, for my judgment, for the judgment of a person who is, let's say, not Black or Hispanic, to look at Washington, D.C. and different effects of the gentrification there and what's happening with Prince George's County and say, you know, this has a meaning to me. And then I'm interested in this and I can have a moral feeling about this. Otherwise, I lived in Kenya for 2 years as well. And it's an incredible country. It's my favorite country I've ever lived in many ways. But I was very stunned, and they will say this openly, that their politics is tribal. In other words, if you are not a Luo, you are not going to vote for the Luo candidate. If you are Kikuyu, you're going to vote for the Kikuyu candidate. So basically, then you have coalition building between smaller tribes. And my Kenyan friends were celebrating. They've been for a little while. They say, we're pleased that American politics seems to be becoming more tribal because now we feel less bad, you know, that it's not that we're just backward, you know, in Africa like we had maybe feared a bit, but it's a human thing. But I also think it's something to work against in some ways. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, it does. It totally makes sense. And it ties in with what I was saying. I always worry that, yes, we need to elevate oppressed communities, and yes, we need to make sure that they have full representation. But there's also this side of me that says, you know, you don't know what any individual has experienced, you know, and I think about having originally come from what became Trump country, you know, that, you know, how are you going to tell somebody who hasn't had a job in 10 years, and the community is dying, half of the houses are shuttered and falling down, and there's no businesses left, and if it's a guy, maybe his kids were, you know, opioid addicted, and you're going to tell him he's not suffering, you know, I mean, who knows what's in anybody's heart, you know, and I guess,
I think that's right.
And so I think it's got to be a mix between recognizing and elevating communities that have been oppressed and understanding that on an individual human level, each and every one of us may be fighting battles that aren't visible from the outside.
I think that's very well put. And I think that this girlfriend that I mentioned, who has a lot of family wealth, her family is like, they have terrible struggles with each other because of this wealth. And I'm not going to say that it's just as bad as being poor or at all similar or anything like that, but I've seen how burdensome it can be for her, and a kind of pain that she experiences. And I almost want her to be able to say, look, I'm purportedly on the receiving end of inequality, and it sucks, right? Because there's something very powerful in that. I mean, I think then one realizes that holistically, it's much more of a problematic system rather than just for those who we don't perceive to be on the receiving end. And I think, people who sometimes I think that the kind of struggles that friends of mine, let's say even health struggles or sort of, or family, a family background of oppression, that they were almost like symbolic or proxies for kind of interior anxieties being part of a very, very sort of difficult, problematic culture. And it feels hard to say that because I don't want to say that, the suffering of a suburbanite is the same as
right.
someone in an urban area, but I think that there was a need to almost make a proxy for one's pain that would be more believable to others. And I really think that's a shame, because I think if we realize that contemporary American culture is one that twists almost everybody in different ways and gives almost everybody pain, that's a source of unity, more than kind of everybody pretending to some level of more kind of obvious difficulty, which may or may not be fabricated. Also, if you say that, the only people who can be the true allies and outspoken allies of people who struggle are other people who struggle, then you're going down a dangerous road, because you're relegating, rich people or whatever, either to being conservatives or to lying. And
right.
That's just not the situation that we want, right?
Yeah, no, I unfortunately we're going to have to leave it there, but I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think we could talk about this, ad infinitum, but we will have to leave it there. I couldn't agree more, and I it's a complex and resonant issue. Maybe you'll write about it again sometime. Maybe we'll talk about it again sometime. But in the meantime, Eve Fairbanks, thanks for writing such a great and thought-provoking piece. Again, it was entitled "Well-Off Millennials Are All Julia Salazar. I Wish We Weren't." So Eve Fairbanks, thanks for writing that, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much. It was great to talk to you.